Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
A party of horsemen started from Richmond with the intention of killing every colored person they saw in Southampton County. They stopped outside the cabin of a free colored man who was hoeing in his little field. They called out, "Is this Southampton County?" He replied, "Yes, sir. You've just crossed the line by yonder tree." They shot him dead and rode on.
They killed Antonio, a slave of Mr. J. Stanley, whom they shot. Then they pointed their guns at him and told him to confess about the insurrection. He told them he didn't know anything about any insurrection. They shot several balls through him, quartered him, and put his head on a pole at the fork of the road leading to the court. He had no trial. They never do.
Although Virginia, in many ways, had long been among the more lenient of slave states with regard to treatment of slaves, in 1831, many white citizens of that state took up arms and went on a murderous rampage. What could have driven Virginia's white population to such a frenzy of terror and rage?
It is with pain that we speak of another feature of the Southampton Rebellion, for we have been most unwilling to have our sympathies for the sufferers diminished or affected by their misconduct. We allude to the slaughter of many blacks without trial and under circumstances of great barbarity. We met with an individual of intelligence who told us that he himself had killed between 10 and 15.
This insurrection, this Southampton Rebellion, was led by a man his followers called General Nat, and is generally considered the most successful slave rebellion in the United States, if one measures success by the number of casualties among the whites. Like all slave revolts within the U.S., both before and after the states separated from Britain to form their own nation, the revolt led by Nat Turner would end in failure. But the terror created by Turner's small army did not disappear with their deaths, or the deaths of countless innocent slaves and free blacks. The slaughters both by and of slaves would horrify the nation and pull it one step further up from slavery. Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 was by no means the first significant revolt by slaves in America. As many as 500 rebellions, large and small, have been identified over the centuries of America's practice of slavery. In no case did the slaves achieve any kind of overthrow of white power, and in almost all cases, the participating slaves, and frequently many others as well, were executed or faced some other harsh penalty. Although we imagine slave uprisings taking place on southern plantations, one of the earliest significant slave revolts occurred not in the South, but in the colony of New York. In 1712, New York City had a relatively large population of slaves. Additionally, large numbers of escaped slaves in the New York colony had made their way to the city, where many joined together in criminal gangs. There were numerous such gangs around the docks, and they frequently clashed violently. White New Yorkers were terrified by these groups, though generally the gangs did not attack whites. Regardless, the white population was already concerned. Since 1702, it had been illegal for slaves to gather in groups larger than 3. Despite these regulations, and despite paid enforcers who flogged violators, slaves in New York City had more opportunities for communication than those on plantations. And in 1712, communication led to conspiracy. On the night of April 6th, a group of 24 African-born slaves gathered together in an orchard on the edge of town. Here they had hidden muskets, hatchets, and swords, which they now took to hand. They set fire to a building and then hid themselves and waited. When the white townsmen showed up to fight the blaze, the slaves opened fire, killing 9 men. An alarm was raised, and the slaves ran off. Militia from the city and Westchester County gathered to hunt the Africans down and eventually surrounded them in the woods of northern Manhattan. 6 of the rebels, probably the leaders, committed suicide. 70 black men, more than actually participated in the uprising, were jailed. Eventually, 27 were tried, and 21 were convicted and executed in a grisly manner. Some were burned alive. At least one was killed on a breaking wheel. The white colonists of New York reacted with even more stringent laws, restricting the movement of slaves and free blacks. Any slave caught with a firearm would receive 20 lashes. Conspiracy by a slave to commit murder was punishable by death, as was rape and destruction of property. South Carolina did not have problems quite as early as New York, in part because the slave owners and their slaves had come from the sugar plantations of the West Indies, and they brought the restrictive slave codes with them. But in 1739, South Carolina's planters faced an armed insurrection. The leader of the rebellion was a slave named Jemmy, who was identified as being from Angola, but was probably from the Congo Empire. The Congo had been going through civil wars for years at the time that Jemmy and his compatriots would have been captured and enslaved. This meant that he and his men would likely have had military experience. Jemmy was slaved on a plantation near the Stono River, about 20 miles southwest of Charleston, South Carolina. On September 9th, 1739, he and 20 other African slaves made an attempt to leave South Carolina for Spanish Florida. England and Spain were at war, and the Spanish sought to destabilize the British colonies and let it be known that slaves who escaped to Florida would be freed and given land. Some slaves had already taken advantage of this offer. The Congo Empire had been Catholic since 1491 and included a large number of Portuguese speakers. Jemmy and his fellow Congo slaves would likely have been attracted to living in a Catholic land and would have had familiarity with the Spanish language. Spain's incentive would have been particularly attractive to them. The timing of their attempt was probably due to South Carolina's Security Act, which would have been enacted at the end of the month. That law would require all white men to carry firearms with them at all times, including Sunday church. On Sundays, slaves were allowed to work for themselves, and white men typically did not go armed. Jemmy and his men were probably intending to take advantage of that fact before the law changed things. They first attacked a shop at the Stono River Bridge, where they killed 2 shopkeepers and seized guns and ammunition. They continued south, killing white men, women, and children along the way. One tavern keeper was spared because he had a reputation for kindness towards his slaves. Another slave owner was spared when his slaves hid him from Jemmy's men. Those slaves were forced to join the insurrection, but they were eventually rewarded for their efforts to save their master. Other slaves joined the march south, and the slave army had 50 men by late morning. Lieutenant Governor William Bull almost became one of their victims. He later reported the incident to the English Board of Trade.
I was returning from Granville County with 4 gentlemen and met these rebels at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and fortunately discerned the approaching danger time enough to avoid it, and to give notice to the militia, who on the occasion behaved with so much expedition and bravery, as by 4 o'clock the same day to come up with them, and killed and took so many as put a stop to any further mischief at that time.
When the militia arrived, they faced an army of as many as 80 rebels. The two armed groups clashed. 20 whites and 44 slaves were killed in the firefight. The rest of the slaves escaped, though most were captured in the months that followed. Again, Lieutenant Governor William Bull.
44 of them have been killed and executed. Some few yet remain concealed in the woods, expecting the same fate. They seem desperate. It was the opinion of His Majesty's Council that one of the most effectual means that could be used at present to prevent such desertion of our Negroes is to encourage some Indians, by a suitable reward, to pursue and, if possible, to bring back the deserters. And while the Indians are thus employed, they would be in the way ready to intercept others that might attempt to follow. I have sent for the chiefs of the Chickasaws living at New Windsor and the Catawba Indians for that purpose.
The colonial government responded to the insurrection by passing an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes and other slaves in 1740. Slaves were prohibited from growing their own food, learning to read, earning their own money, or meeting in groups. Some of these regulations had existed previously, but had not been enforced. The South Carolina legislature also sought to address potential causes of the rebellion by setting penalties for masters who were brutal with their slaves or who worked them excessively. Consider that excessive work meant more than 15 hours of work per day in the summer, or 14 hours of work per day in the winter.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.